I take great pleasure in introducing Dr. Naomi Wolf. She has flown down from New York for this session. She is a journalist like all of us, but and like many of us here, certainly me, kept a very close eye on the pandemic and the development of the vaccine and how the world reacted to it. Dr. Wolf has documented her findings in a book called The Pfizer Papers, Crime Against Humanity. And I think the name kind of says it all, but we'll leave that to her to explain what the findings were. Once again, to all the members of the audience, you can scan the QR code, which you can see right here and also on your tables, actually. So if you could just scan that. The question this time is, do you trust big pharma, pharmaceutical companies? Do you trust them? So that's my question. And till the time you answer that question, I'm going to get started with Dr. Wolf. Dr. Wolf, tell us a little about Pfizer Papers, Crime Against Humanity. What are your findings?
Thank you so much. I will tell you in just a minute, but first I really just want to thank and appreciate my hosts at India Today, you, and all of you for welcoming me here. It's been such a warm welcome. I was last at an India Today conference in India 20 years ago, and it's an absolute joy to be back. So I should clarify, as I promised, I'm not a medical doctor. I have a doctorate in Victorian poetry. The project that led to the Pfizer Papers really happened almost by accident. Some of you may know my work because I've been a well-known feminist writer for 40 years. I've written 8 or 9 international bestsellers, and usually my subjects are women's issues, especially women's sexual and reproductive health, and then general civil liberties, civil rights issues. They're, of course, related, especially important to note on International Women's Day. But the book came about, and I'll tell you in a moment what it is, because I was doing what I've done for 40 years that made me a quote-unquote feminist icon. I was reporting accurately on social media at that time in 2021 that women were beginning to report eyewitnesses to their own bodies, menstrual problems or dysregulation after having received the mRNA COVID injections, which had been rolled out in the United States at the end of 2020. And literally, this is the kind of reporting I've done my whole life. I broke the story on problems with silicone breast implants. I've covered, problems with IUDs. We all know about problems with thalidomide. The idea that new pharmaceutical products can have damaging effects on women or humans, but certainly women, that are not immediately apparent is not a new idea. Feminists used to know that. That's the reason why
look at the results right behind us. You trust Big Pharma, 32% of you don't trust, or rather trust Big Pharma, and 66% in the audience are saying they don't trust Big Pharma.
I mean, healthy skepticism is a good quality to have in this world generally, until things are well proven. But just to quickly fast forward,
yes.
When I accurately reported that, I was canceled by Twitter, Facebook, smeared around the world, my reputation turned upside down worldwide, which was weird at that time. I didn't understand that AI was probably already in use in 2021. And it turned out later, through lawsuits brought by the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana, that it was the White House that had put pressure on Twitter and Facebook to delete me, cancel me, smear me. That doesn't matter. What matters is Steve Bannon, who I thought was my existential adversary, the advisor to President Trump, did want to hear what I had to say, invited me onto his show, and I continued to raise questions about these injections based on my knowledge that I was accruing in my research. Then he said, okay, the Pfizer papers have been released. These are 450,000 documents, internal documents, Pfizer's own documents, collated as they tested and developed this injection. And a successful lawsuit against the Food and Drug Administration, which had custody of these documents, resulted in the release of these documents. But Bannon and I both knew as journalists there was no way that would be useful unless we could get experts to read through them and issue reports. So the Pfizer Papers, which is the book that led me to be here is the result of that project. 3,250 highly credentialed doctors and scientists from all over the world joined together under our aegis and produced these now 109 reports. 50 of the most important are collected in this book, the Pfizer documents.
So all vaccines have side effects, and Pfizer's vaccine was no different, is what you're saying. But the side
That's
effects...
exactly not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That is not what I'm saying.
The side effects that were, you say, were concealed by Pfizer were the ones that they should have spoken about, is what they kept concealed conveniently, and the effects were far damaging than what we were told about, is what you're saying, right?
Well, can I just say what I'm saying? Because your summary of what I'm saying is not
right.
correct.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the process in my country, because I don't know the process in your country. But in the West, in North America, vaccines and other medical products come to the market after, well, vaccines usually after 10 or 15 years of safety studies, showing for sure, including longitudinal studies, which continue over time, right, showing for sure that they're safe and effective. That's the metric. And then they go to the Food and Drug Administration, which either allows them to be sold in the marketplace, continues to track them, or else doesn't allow them to be sold. Well, these are not normal vaccines, right? Because in your country, as well as in mine and all over the world, but I'll just talk about the Pfizer injection, because that's the one I have the documentation for, they were rushed through in 10 months, and then they were released under a kind of do not pass go, do not collect $200, to use monopoly metaphors. They were released under what's called an emergency use authorization, which is basically the FDA saying you don't have to go through the normal process of proving that they're safe and effective. It's an emergency, you can just put them in the marketplace. But when I say it's not anything like other vaccines, that's not the only difference. But also what we found in the Pfizer papers is that the levels of deaths and severe injuries, severe damage of all kinds, and I can get into details, but especially the centerpiece of reproductive damage, which is at the very heart of the Pfizer papers, what Pfizer was looking at, as we say in tech, it's not a bug, it's a feature, that was what they knew about. They knew about it before they rolled it out. They knew about it while they were rolling it out. They continued for 3 months that are spanned in the Pfizer papers to collect documentation of 1,225 deaths in just 3 months reported by doctors, horrific damage of the kind that I'll describe to you in detail. And they knew within 1 month that the vaccines didn't work to stop COVID. In fact, Pfizer's language is failure of efficacy, quote unquote, and vaccine failure, quote unquote. That's their language. I'm not editorializing. That's their conclusion. They reached that conclusion in November of 2020. Again, 1 month into marketing it. So everything that followed, the mandates, the lost jobs, the kids missing school unless they were injected in states in the United States, the division of society in my country between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the discriminatory laws, the deaths, the injuries, the sterilizations, the fact that we now have a 13 to 20% drop in live births. There's a 13 to 20% drop in live births according to government data sets around the world. I understand also in India there's a drop in live births. The excess deaths, which are universal around the world in vaccinated countries. None of that was necessary. It was all based upon a lie. The vaccines didn't work to stop COVID. The number 3 side effect in the Pfizer papers is COVID.
I want to ask you, a lot of people would ask this, if not the vaccine, then what? How could have we moved forward given the situation that we had at hand?
Yeah, so you and I had
Yes.
you're a good journalist. I want to commend you for a tough bulldog approach. I think that that's respectfully a misleading question, because I've just said the vaccines didn't work. Maybe your vaccine worked. I don't have the internal documents. I invite your manufacturer to release their internal documents so my experts can take a look at what was provided here in India and other countries where your vaccine was distributed. But the vaccine didn't work. So as I said to you when you asked me that earlier, when humans are faced with something, a technology that does not work, they keep looking for solutions. That's not what happened. People who early on, doctors who were using other methods of treating COVID and keeping their patients out of the hospital, keeping their patients from getting sicker. Those methods include, in my country, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. They were having good outcomes, high doses of vitamin C. Those doctors were delicensed in my country. They were certainly canceled and censored. They lost their jobs. They faced lawfare. They were made fun of. The FDA released a whole marketing campaign. I'm sorry, it was the CDC making fun of ivermectin, as you may recall. So again, I'm not a medical doctor, but these were some other methods that were showing promise. They were suppressed, and everything was directed, including force in my country, economic force, threats, shaming, legal discrimination, into, compelling people to take this injection, which the manufacturers, the White House, the CDC, we have emails among Dr. Fauci, Dr. Walensky, 15 White House staffers. They knew by April of 2021 that this injection was hurting the hearts of minors and young, healthy adult males. They kept pushing it anyway. They didn't come clean. So I would say to you, there are many other things that could well have helped, but they were prevented from being explored.
So people were convinced that the vaccine works because the data was published and it was peer-reviewed and published.
What data? I asked you this in our conversation.
Yes,
what data?
There was peer-reviewed data.
What peer-reviewed data?
That spoke about the efficacy of the
what
vaccine.
What peer-reviewed data?
Published on the NHAM and the BMJ.
What study? You'll have to show me, what you're referring to so I can look at it.
What I'm trying to ask you is that people were immediately drawn to the vaccine because of data that the government spoke about as well, and Pfizer was in conversation for the longest time to come to India as well, but that never worked out. That's the reason why people had faith on the vaccine. A lot of people did. India as a country vaccinates a lot, and that's the reason why it was not very difficult to get people to come and take the vaccine, unlike many other countries. So
which vaccine did people get in India?
In India, people got two vaccines. One was Covishield, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine, the adenovirus vaccine. And the second one was a indigenous Covaxin, which was an inactivated vaccine.
So just a point of information, you know that the AstraZeneca vaccine was withdrawn from the market.
Yes, but my question is about the Pfizer vaccines.
Right.
The data that was published showing efficacy, and that's how it was introduced.
I'm not trying to badger you. I'm really not. What data? I mean, you're saying to me...
I can get into the details of that data and what it showed in the percentages of the efficacy levels, but what I'm saying is that the vaccine was introduced, an emergency authorization was given. One of the first vaccines to get an emergency authorization was the Pfizer vaccine. The WHO backed it, the CDC backed it. What I'm asking is that what was going on for them to get, behind the scenes, as per your research, is what I'm trying to ask you. So these clearances were given, and that's how the vaccine was introduced to the population. What was going on behind the scenes for these clearances to come through?
I see.
Is what I'm asking.
I understand your question. Again, I hope you'll understand when I say over and over what data, I'm really encouraging kind of a revolution in our sense of our responsibility as consumers of information. And what I mean by that is it's very important for us no longer to say, well, those are the doctors, they're the experts, or those are the scientists, they're the experts, or that's the media, they're the experts. I don't mean you. India Today is fabulous. Or, that's the CDC or the FDA, they're the experts. We really need to, and this complete collapse of trustworthiness of the FDA, the CDC, the American media, the Western media, in terms of reporting things that were not true or that were skewed scientifically, and that's why I keep saying what data, and I'll get to that in a minute. We have to start to read those studies ourselves and evaluate them ourselves and become literate scientifically. I started out by saying I'm in English, my DPhil is in English literature. I'm not trained as a scientist, but now I know how to read a scientific paper. It's not rocket science, and I know how to see flaws in methodology. And we all have to get accustomed to that, because you asked, what was this process? What happened was millions of dollars flowed, we now know, to journals like The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, the gold standard peer-reviewed scientific and medical publications. And then they would not publish good science that showed problems with the vaccine, but they would publish what turned out to be very bad studies, flawed studies, that claimed to show safety and efficacy. One example is just the Shimabukuro study, peer-reviewed, that early on was used by the CDC, by public health entities throughout North America to tell pregnant women that this vaccine was safe for their fetuses and for themselves. It wasn't safe, and the way they got to that was by stopping looking at babies after 2 weeks, right? As well as other flaws in methodology. But this was very common. The peer-reviewed process has been compromised. Another example is the PCR test. The PCR test, which is what was used to identify infections, right? It's a real test, but the inventor of it said, don't use it at too high a cycle threshold or it will generate false positives. The World Health Organization issued a press release that was quickly swallowed up that said don't run it at high cycle thresholds. But governments and testing centers ran it at cycle thresholds that are too high, generating untold false positives. So our data about the extent of the pandemic can't be verified based on PCR tests.
So you also feel that the pandemic in that sense were exaggerated in terms of the numbers?
I don't know. I don't know. As a journalist, I'm saying there's a problem with a lot of the data. I can give you other examples, but that's kind of a different question. Do you want me to go to
No,
that?
I just want to now just move a little ahead because in our conversation we were talking about way things could have been done differently. All of us here in India during the pandemic have taken ashwagandha, have taken shilajit, have taken vitamin C and also resorted to traditional systems of treatment, which many of us, and I was just telling Dr.
Naomi
Wolf about it, the fact that this happened in India, but that didn't happen in the US is what you're saying, and that's where you felt short as a country. This should have been done. Vitamin C should have been encouraged.
Okay, so
Immunity building should have been
do you want me to
encouraged.
answer your question
Yes.
about how the skewing of conclusions about the vaccine happened?
Yes, sure. Then
and
we'll
then
get
go
to
on
the
to that?
immunity,
Sure.
yes, yeah.
So I talked about the kind of corruption of the peer review process. Also, the media in North America and Western Europe was very corrupted. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, of course, Bill Gates was a major investor in the mRNA injection. They were flowing millions of dollars to previously very respected news outlets to quote-unquote overcome vaccine hesitancy. So $55 million to the BBC, for instance. The New York Times got money. NPR got money. The Guardian got money. And you know, if you run a news business, margins are very tight. So a few $1 million makes a very big difference. But it means that when problems were being surfaced by real journalists and real doctors, those respected news outlets didn't want to cover them, and they kept reproducing inaccurate claims by the CDC, by Dr. Fauci, and so on, that this was safe and effective. The other issue is the CARES Act in the United States, $1 billion from the government itself to basically pay off quote-unquote trusted influencers, all the way from churches and synagogues and mosques down to tiny dance troupes in Queens or, little regional news outlets. So basically the whole culture of communication was bought and paid for by Pharma, and then it was a closed circle. Our tax dollars paid for, the vaccines, so shareholders in Pfizer and Moderna and so on were doing very, very well. And then, as I mentioned, critics were silenced. Why were critics silenced? Millions of dollars went to professional organizations representing doctors and obstetricians and gynecologists, pediatricians, to make sure that the doctors in their organizations didn't go off script, and the money had to be paid back if doctors gave actual informed consent to their patients. So it was a whole mechanism of propaganda and coercion. And the last thing I'll mention is something called the COVID-19 Project. And this started in March of 2020, very early, before we could possibly know how serious the pandemic was going to be. And this was a coalition of ordinary competitors, and I'm a tech CEO, so I recognize how weird this is, right? These are competitors: Facebook, Twitter, Bloomberg, Microsoft, Nintendo, Amazon. The big tech entities aligned. Why? to communicate around the world the same messages about lockdowns and about COVID and then about vaccines. That's why you heard the same messaging around the world. Don't visit grandma, you'll kill her at Thanksgiving. Don't visit grandma, you'll kill her at Hanukkah. Don't visit grandma, you'll kill her at Diwali. All around the world the same. That's only possible through this alliance of tech bros. So I followed the money. What happens when you force a lockdown and you keep people from shopping on Main Street, worshiping in churches and synagogues and mosques, going to school? They're on their phones or they're on their computers. Amazon revenue, 2021, 2022, 23% up. Nintendo, a dying breed, double digits up. Microsoft, double digits up. Bloomberg, double digits up. Big tech made out like bandits. And it was a massive wealth transfer from middle-class people, middle-class shop owners, middle-class property owners, working-class people to big tech and big pharma.
So it was not just the big pharma benefiting, but big tech as well. But how would you then stop the transmission is my question. A country of 1.4 billion people, if you move around when there is an infectious disease and the outcomes are severe in many people, especially in the second wave of the pandemic, how else would you stop the transmission?
So again, I'm not a medical doctor and I don't want to, I'm not an epidemiologist. I do feel very lucky though to have, I got my DPhil in Oxford in English literature, and so I've read 400 years of English literature, which includes memoirs, letters, journals, and what is clear from that is that humanity faces wave after wave of infectious disease. And overwhelmingly, in the last 400 years, they've been much more serious, right? Not to minimize COVID, but typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, yellow fever, pneumonia in 1918, much more serious. For 100 years, we've known, public health has known how not to handle the spread of infectious diseases. What do? Ventilation, sunshine, vitamin C, good nutrition. You boost immunities. You don't have the opposite is what we were told to do, at least in America and Western Europe. You don't crowd people into households, multi-generational households, lock them in, depress their immune systems by closing off beaches and playgrounds, as we did in the United States and Western Europe, not pay any attention to nutrition, not pay any attention to, sanitation or hygiene. All of that is what we used to know escalated infectious disease transmission, and that's what we were told to do. It made no sense.
I can go on and on about this, Naomi, about the fact that transmission had to be stopped, and that was the number one priority as far as the Indian government was concerned, given our population. And I don't think there was any other option, at least in the first wave of the pandemic when we didn't know what hit us. Right. I think the situation was the same all over the world, where many countries went in for a lockdown. I just want to move on a little and take this discussion forward to talk.
Before you do, can I add one thing?
Yes.
About prevention?
Yes.
What's really weird about the Pfizer papers is that there's almost nothing in those 450,000 documents about respiratory infection. There's almost nothing about nasal passages, breathing, oxygen levels, lung capacity, mucous membranes. It's really, as I mentioned, all targeted at damaging your ovaries, damaging sperm, damaging placentas, aborting babies, causing miscarriages of babies, fetal hemorrhage, menstrual dysregulation. But what's fascinating, I'm not vaccinated at all. Thank God, I'm not COVID vaccinated. My parents gave me the 4 vaccines that my generation had when we were children. But early on, I'm a tech CEO, early on I saw that the biotech industry journalism was much more excited about the mRNA platform than were the medical journals. And that gave me pause. But the reason I bring this up is Dr. McCullough, one of the dissident doctors, has a protocol where you rinse out with a neti pot your nasal passages 4 times a day with a betadine solution, which is an iodine solution over the counter. It's been used for 40 years, very common. And once I got COVID, it lasted 24 hours because I used his protocol. Everyone in my family uses his protocol when they get COVID. They get over it in 24 hours. He says, I don't have this except from him, that Pakistan uses nasal rinses, and that's how they prevented widespread transmission. You know, it's a viral infection, so intuitively it makes sense that if you can kill the virus in your nasal passages before it gets into your lungs, that is good prevention. So that's just anecdotal, but I think it's interesting that that wasn't even studied.
You know, we're running quickly, we're running out of time, and I'll quickly ask you just a last question on pharmacovigilance, because it's not just about COVID and the vaccine associated with COVID, but by and large, the problems that various countries at different levels experience. India has its own set of problems when it comes to clearances, substandard medicines. What about the US? Do you think the government needs to really now work together with pharmaceutical companies and with regulators to ensure that the best medicine gets the clearances for the general population? And what has COVID taught us in that sense? Because clearly the audience has got very little faith on Big Pharma.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say thank God for your Ayurvedic tradition in this country. When we have learned the nature of the damage that the mRNA injections cause, I've been doing very in-depth, videos about herbs and the Ayurvedic tradition as well, because there are things that have worked to counter inflammation, which is one of the functions of the injection, to counter, to boost circulation, as clotting is one of the functions of the injection, to support nervous system efficacy, because damaging the nervous system's myelin sheath is one of the functions of the injection. So I'm delighted. I have to say, the Indian population, anecdotally, impressionistically, looks much healthier than American and Western Europe populations now. And there was a dramatic change after the mRNA injection rolled out. So don't stop, whatever that is. But pharmacovigilance, look, I do everything possible now to avoid taking any prescription medication and to avoid ever getting hospitalized, God willing, because I've seen from the Pfizer papers that the FDA just rubber stamped, charts showing babies getting sick, charts showing a baby dying, charts of 10,000, 15,000 women, 7,500 women with horrible bleeding every day, bleeding twice a month, hemorrhaging, no periods at all, meaning completely, infertile, and these 1,225 deaths, neurological diseases, strokes, heart attacks, dropping dead, which you're seeing.
Something that's been seen in India as well, but the government, I just want to conclude this, Dr. Wolf, has said that this isn't linked to the vaccine that was given in the country. Dr. Wolf, ours was an inactivated vaccine. At least one vaccine was inactivated, and the other was adenovirus. But the government studies indicates that these heart attacks that we're seeing in the younger population, there is no increase, and also it's not linked to the vaccine, but to COVID is what has been said. I'm really running out of time. Preeti is looking at me. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. It was a delightful conversation.
I would graciously want to give you the last word, but I have to say young, healthy adults didn't just drop dead on the playing field. Dropping dead or falling from a great height is in the SEC filing in 2021 for the BioNTech injection. And I invite the government of India to release the internal documents related to these vaccines. We'll happily go through them. And thank you for your welcome.